without further ado, I want to introduce you to our first panel. And this panel will be on setting the AIDS national cross-sectional context in US. And Deb Morrison will be your moderator. So Deb, feel free to take it from here.
Thank you. I invite the panelists for panel one to go ahead and turn their cameras on, and you can turn your mics on if you have a quiet environment, or just turn your mics on as you pop into the conversation. All right, I'm so excited to be here and to introduce this amazing, amazing panel. Our panel is entitled Setting the U.S. National Context, Cross-Sectoral Elements of the Agenda. And we're hoping to really address an overarching question of why are equitable learning opportunities, i.e. the components of ACE, important in fostering just climate action? What could and should be done? And so we're going to hear some introductory comments from our different panelists in a moment. But first, I just want to give you a brief overview. The bios for all the panelists that will be found on our shared space. So we're not going to use all of our time here talking about the amazing histories and experiences of all these folks. Instead, I'll just give a brief introduction. If panelists can kind of, well, I see everybody's got their name up, so thanks so much for that. But let's start with, we have Daniel Wildcat, a professor and accomplished scholar from the Haskell Indian Nations University, knowledgeable in Indigenous knowledge, technology, environment, and education. We have Sonal Jessel, who works to advance climate justice actions within Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. We have two people from the Alliance for Climate Education, Vic Barrett and Ariana Khan, who engage in climate advocacy and literacy work. And we have Niepold, who is from the Mara Partners and works with businesses, governments, and organizations on intersectional issues of justice. So we'll start our conversation with Daniel, and then Sonal, Vic, Ariana, and Mil will give some opening comments. I'm just thinking about why are equitable learning opportunities important in fostering just climate action?
Yeah, well, there are a couple things. First of all, welcome everyone. Good morning. I'm speaking to you all from this beautiful south bank of the Kansas River in northeast Kansas. I want to honor the Osage and the Kaw people, the original peoples of this place, and it's a good day. But education, to me, is the perfect opportunity for us to really enact change, the change that we need. I think the biggest challenge we have is to break out of the disciplines, the silos, the boxes, if you will, that people work in, live in, and start to really think about how we can empower communities, families, people on the ground. And I think education is a great vehicle for that. I think our challenge is going to be to really take education outside the walls of the academy and think about ways in which we can start doing active demonstration projects around climate change, around food security, around housing security, around renewable energy. All of these challenges, very real challenges people face, very aware of these challenges in our indigenous homelands here in North America. But I mean, these are challenges that many people face in our society. And I think those are opportunities for research, but it means really preparing different kinds of strategies for how to engage families, communities, grandparents, aunties, uncles, everyone in addressing very real problems. And I think rather than us going and telling people what we're going to do for them, we need to listen to what they want our help in solving. People have a pretty good idea of what their basic problems are, where they live, and we need to listen and then try to put together some strategies for addressing those. That's where education should be right now, in addressing these challenges in a very practical demonstration project sort of way.
Thank you.
Thank
Sonal?
you. Sonal? Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. My name is Sonal, and I work for We Act for Environmental Justice. We're based in Harlem, New York City, and do work across the city, the state, and the federal government as well. I'll just say, first of all, I want to echo what was already said. I completely agree that it's important to break down the silos that exist in our educational system across the United States and even across the world. And especially that's important when thinking about climate change and climate justice work, because it is such an intersectoral issue. It affects every sector of our world. And so it's really important that everyone understands what's important, what the tools we need to use and the type of education needed to address climate change and do it in a way that is through the lens of climate justice. And I'll also say that's, you know, it's a common thinking that a lot of top-down power comes from not offering equitable access to education for people and really holding people back from being able to have the tools that they need to fight for their communities, for their homelands, for the spaces that they care about, for any type of environmental justice work. And so that's one thing why equitable learning is so important, is because education and understanding the systems that we're working in gives us the power to do the work that we want to do. So I'll say that's the biggest reason for me why it's so important to have equitable learning opportunities, and why it's so important for us to all meet today, is to really put our heads together and find out what we all know collectively, and think about how we can also share that with our communities and the people that we work with on a daily basis.
Thank you. Vic?
Yeah. So I'm Vic. I work with the Alliance for Climate Education as a democracy organizer in Madison, Wisconsin. Mostly just trying to get young people out to vote, trying to educate them about how they register to vote, at least in the state of Wisconsin. I actually used to be a fellow with the Alliance for Climate Education when I was in high school, benefiting from a lot of our programs that had this exact goal of teaching us about climate science and teaching us about how to take climate action. And even working in that campaign when I was in high school and learning about those things, the decision we came to about what change we wanted to make in our own city was to get climate education mandated in New York City public schools, because we had this realization that if we wanted to make the huge difference that we wanted to make on the climate crisis, we needed as many other young people with us. And we were realizing how much our peers just didn't even learn about climate change in the first place. So I think that kind of echoes a little bit of what Sonal was saying. And then secondly, I think why it's so important to have equitable learning opportunities in these conversations is I think that there's still a lot of blind spots as to the intersections between these issues and racial justice and gender justice and a lot of these other conversations. And I think if we have comprehensive education on how these systems of power intersect in the ways that they cause climate change and intersects in the ways that they cause difficulty in a lot of marginalized groups' day-to-day lives, that we could have a more holistic way of going about fighting the climate crisis.
Thank you. Aryaana?
Hi, my name is Ariana Khan, and I'm also based in New York City. I'm currently an undergrad student in the City College of New York. And I got my introduction to, learning about climate change even was like, I got my introduction back in high school through different organizations, because this education was not something that was provided to me by the public school system. And Vic and I actually worked on that bill together, trying to pass it, which didn't happen when I was there. But, we're getting there, fixing our education system. But personally, I've had to live through climate impacts. So I was born and raised in Bangladesh, which is a small country next to India. And we have annual flooding and all of these horrible climate impacts, including very recently with like Cyclone Amphan. And I didn't have language to put it together that these were even climate impacts, because that's how much the education was lacking. And when I moved to New York City and I witnessed like Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Sandy, something clicked in me. It was like, okay, these impacts were not supposed to be here. I thought I had left them behind in Bangladesh, and I didn't. And that's when I learned about climate change, which is a little too late, 13 years too late, actually. But I like, it's so important to like be able to see how these issues are connected to our daily lives, you know, even if it's not direct impacts that we live through. It's important to see that. And young people now, you know, are born into the world with, you know, these immediate impacts, and they're putting the dots together. So obviously, like, coming together like this is super important, and like making that information accessible, you know, whether that's in the education system or through different organizations, is super important.
Thank you. Mel.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, whatever time zone you're in. I'm honored and thrilled to be here with you all. I should just say, jumping right off the bat, so Mill Pierce and I founded the Mara Partners, and we work at the intersection of climate, equity, and gender, notably. We work globally, I should say that right now. I'm thrilled to be speaking about the US context, because I think we're at an interesting time in the US where so much of what we're doing has negative impacts worldwide. But I'm bringing sort of a message of hope from the work that's been done globally as well. And equitable learning opportunities for me are incredibly exciting on 2 or 3 different levels. In my work, what I've seen is that when women are empowered in communities, the spillover benefits accrue to their children, and notably to their girl child. And we see rising education levels worldwide when women receive even what might seem rudimentary levels of education or even training. So if we keep a wide frame outside of just strict education, K-12, even job training, in my experience, any kind of training, any kind of education has these spillover benefits. So while we're excited in helping women, what I love about that is that that also helps on the CO2 reduction emissions, notably because we all know, and Drawdown and others have spoken at length about the fact that when women are empowered and girls receive education, they make reproductive health choices that have positive CO2 gains, benefits. So it works on 2 levels. So what I really boil it all down to is that if we put an equitable lens and an inclusive lens around all of our work on climate, the rest will actually start to sort itself out. And the last thing I'll say is that my background was originally in human rights. And it has taken my, as I call us, the human rights tribe, really too long to understand that climate change is the frame. Human rights, all the work that I do on child labor and forced labor and so on, will fall apart if we don't get climate change right. So I'm encouraging all of the stakeholders to step out of that narrow human rights frame and step into a climate frame. And we'll talk more about the other aspects in a minute, but thank you.
Thank you. I want to really just name that intersectionality that you've all talked about, and this climate justice in the center of the work is something we'll expand more on as we talk. And thinking about that, how is it that we center climate justice examples, activities, experiences from vulnerable frontline communities, from the folks doing this work in so many places, and that have been doing this work in some cases for millennia, in ACE efforts? How do we draw that learning out into the work that we're doing in ACE? And Vic, I think you're going to lead this off.
Yeah, I would say that how most effectively to center that is definitely making sure that really intentional space is being created for people from those different lived experiences, facing different frontline issues, can be in the room and be talking about their own stories. I think that a lot of the times that may be easier said than done, but also I see that sometimes it's just not a really intentional space that's being created, because you have to consider, you know, pulling people into different environments to ask for their opinions, and like how safe that could feel for them, and how you could just basically create the most comfortable environment for people from various backgrounds to come give their input, because the best solutions always come from the communities that are being directly impacted. And I think that doing the intentional work to make sure those communities can be involved in a comfortable way is important.
Thank you. Sonal?
Yeah, I'll also add to that from a lot of the work that WeAct has been doing over the 31 years they've been there, and I have not been there for 31 years, but the work that WeAct has been doing involves really intense community engagement work. We build all of our policy initiatives from the community up, and that involves just starting any type of environmental issue that we're talking about with the question of like, what's going on with you? Like, what are you dealing with? And then building from there. And I think through the different planning processes that we've been through, and I'm sure a lot of other organizations have also done similar work, you can kind of build a type of framework for how to properly engage people and how to make sure that you don't kind of drop off from community engagement at a certain point of this like development, and that, you know, you figure out how to really bring community all the way through the process, through the actual writing of the policy to the implementation to everything that it might be. And a lot of that involves like building leadership, building skill sets, and investing in the work in a way that's not just let's ask you questions, but let's build out a bigger program that kind of equips people that want those tools with how to like create the policy and how to actually learn that process for themselves. And that really helps to center the climate justice if you're involving the community in that really, really deep way. So here, I think in this planning process, what we can do is that people that have that experience and do that kind of work can bring in their lessons learned of how they properly involve people and what they've heard from their community members, not just what they've heard from their own expertise, I think is a really important piece of that, and to center the folks that have been doing that work.
All right, Ariana?
Yeah, I think about this question a lot actually, and it almost feels like a double-edged sword, because on one hand, you know, oftentimes folks that are in vulnerable positions are expected to be leading this work and like expected to be educating the room on their traumas or their past experiences and on the solutions that they have in mind, because not because they like chose to sit down and think about it, but because they actually had to experience it, right? And as someone like who's been in a lot of different rooms from the age of 13, I've been doing this work, and like I've seen, you know, places that are doing grassroots organizing versus like sat in rooms that are writing policy. And in every place, like I one, feel out of place, and two, it feels like, you know, I'm bringing so many different experiences that I don't know how to synthesize it. And so obviously, like, we need to be doing better, you know, inviting different people into the table, and also just that's also not enough, right? Like, have them also take up space at that table, have them give their input without expecting them to constantly educate. And I don't know how to like walk that fine balance. But definitely with young people, you know, folks that are doing work in racial justice and like, you know, at all of these different intersections with climate, just having them sit together and like facilitating these conversations before you jump into an action plan, because oftentimes we tend to do this thing where it's like, okay, we talked about it for 5 minutes, what's going to change now? And oftentimes that's not how change happens. It happens through a gazillion different conversations. And, you know, a lot of the folks in this panel, I've run into you guys in different conferences or different events, and we had those gazillion conversations, and now we're here. So just continue doing this.
Thank you. And I think you named one of the things that we named in our acknowledgement statement around this idea of, you know, reciprocity and relationality, like how we work together in a lot of different ways and how we share and build together going forward. Mill and then Daniel. Yeah.
Thanks, Deb. I'm going to use an example related to community work in farming. And if you'll permit me to bring in a global example, because it marries very well to a US example. In my experience, what I like to think of this as a stealth approach. If you were to come in, let's say, to a place, let's just take the example I'm going to use, which is in Ghana. If you were to come in with, we need to get more women at the table at the state house level, and we need this, and we need this, and it's a whole different frame that wouldn't necessarily be successful. But what we've seen in our work, both in Ghana and West Africa, and also in communities, farm working communities here in this country, is that when you have a narrow focus, you have unlikely allies where you can bring in the private sector to train women, because the private sector is under a lot of pressure right now to be equitable and inclusive on racial lines, gender lines, in every kind of way. So what we're harnessing is that pressure to be equitable means that you'll bring in more women to be community organizers, farm working, organizing, and so on. And what we find is that once they have that first taste of empowerment and that first level of training, what then happens is this sort of almost an agency spillover effect happens where, and again, this is the Ghanaian example, once they were trained in farm work and farm work organizing, a third of the women we worked with went on to run for office. And these were women who were 25 years old. Not only did they run for office, they won. And this is at the local level. And what's exciting about that is that all of you on this call know that when women are in office, they also start to change climate policy from the top down. So I like this stealth approach of getting them at the bottom, the middle, and the top, and come at it from multiple angles.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, there's tremendous opportunities, and everyone's given some really good examples. I'll give you another example. We ran a program here for 2 years. It was funded by the EPA called the Eco Ambassadors, and our students really shaped a program on how to green the Haskell campus. It's a very large campus, a little under 500 acres, and a large part of that is the wetlands. The wetlands was destroyed by a highway that was subsequently built by the city. One of the things they undertook was to restore this habitat, make sure this habitat that was greatly perturbed by this highway construction would still be maintained and try to mitigate some of the damage, the harm that was done. And so part of what they did is they did a couple of weekends where they invited the Lawrence, Kansas community to come to visit the wetlands so they could talk about the value of a wetlands ecosystem. They could talk about the kind of habitat it provided for plants and animals. And the ecosystem, I don't like to use this term, but this is a term du jour, ecosystem services, if you will, what a wetlands can do for a landscape. It was really very successful, and I think we got young people engaged, K through 12, we got the parents out there, and I think these are the kinds of education activities that, you know, can really sow seeds then for children, parents, grandparents to get involved. And so I think anything that we can do that takes education outside the classrooms and into the community and on the ground. And, you know, it might be an urban environment, it might be you know, a rural environment, and many of our reservations, we have, you know, incredible landscapes that are yet very threatened by the activities that might be going on upstream, and then they get downstream effects. So I think climate change is such a great opportunity for us to bring everyone together and start demonstrating to them in ways maybe they haven't thought of before how climate change is impacting them. And I think this is really, you know, that's what it's all about. There are some people that climate change is kind of an abstraction. You know, they don't really, you know, think about climate change. I mean, they'll acknowledge, oh, well, we have climate change, that's bad. But if you ask them about, well, how are you experiencing climate change, they might not be able to tell you right away. Our job is to start showing them how you are being affected right now. It doesn't matter whether you're in Manhattan, New York, or Manhattan, Kansas. You are being impacted right now by climate change, and kind of show people that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In thinking about how we show people this, I would say is the sort of next thought to build on from all you've shared so far is really thinking about what it is that we can do to better build structures to share these ideas, to, like many of the things you were just saying, Daniel, around intergenerational learning, getting people outside, having learning part of the everyday in all of our contexts, you know, and many other of you have alluded to this in all different ways. How is it that we can have this be more of a structural aspect of the ACE work, funded, supported in particular ways, so that the innovative and holistic work that's being done on climate justice and resilience is actually the work that's lifted and centered as we go forward. And I think Emil had alluded to that too. Like if that is in the center of our work, then potentially we are actually going in a direction that all else will follow in terms of climate justice. Is there anyone that wants to weigh in on this first? And just a note, Daniel, we're still having a little bit of scratchiness on your mic. So it might be just where your computer's sitting. I'm chatting on the side. Sonal, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I have kind of two basic thoughts on it. I think first of all is kind of what Aryaana said about kind of building in the time for that process instead of just jumping into the solution making, but really even storytelling is a really very important, very powerful way for people to learn about what frontline communities might be going through, whether that's through some of us that might be working with people and like helping to kind of pass the message along, or if someone that is going through some type of hardship wants to take that space and tell their own story, to do that. That I think is always important to build in that time beforehand, instead of just jumping into solution. It's kind of like in a lot of work that we all do is the needs assessment. You know, like that's kind of what it is. It's like, let's understand where we're at first before we pick solutions and jump into solutions, because so often we'll just get off track and do the wrong thing. And that's something that I think a lot of us have learned from all types of like humanitarian work, for example, is like the need to do that understanding first. So I think that storytelling is really important. And then I think the second piece is the funding aspect. So often grassroots organizations are not given the funding that they need to do this work. They're the ones that don't get the money. There's a lot of structural reasons for that, but I think one thing is the people that are making decisions of where the money goes might not actually be experts on climate justice or environmental justice, so it might not be best identifying where that funding should go. And so that's something to think about for big funders and people in philanthropy, is like, how do we make sure that there's people that are experts in this subject and have done the work that can really identify organizations and grassroots, specifically organizations that are doing the work, and really center that as a process, because so often grassroots organizations get overlooked when it comes to funding, and that is a very important thing we all need to do the work. So those are my two buckets of thought.
Thank you. Vic, I think.
Yeah, I would say too, kind of going to the bottom lines, that grassroots organizations do get ignored a lot when it comes to funding, and I think that has to do with the accessibility to funding. Like so many young people that I work with a lot of the time feel so like overwhelmed and stressed by like the grant applications. You know, if you're a high school student or a college student still trying to do really good work, like you also maybe aren't trained on how to write like a 30-page grant application. And so I think that whatever rubrics or systems in place to decide where the funds are being given to need to really like have a holistic view in themselves of like the different realities that a lot of people are existing in. Another example being that you know, a lot of orgs, I feel like kind of backing away from always wanting to fund like the best, most innovative, crazy, like out of this world project. And also just being willing to like fund overhead for some of these organizations who are maybe just trying to like pay youth interns or things like that. Because even though, you know, it's not preferable that the world works that way, like people need money also a lot of the times to do this work, and can't like balance trying to get that money with also like, I guess I have to think of the best project ever in order to do it, when really you're just trying to like do what's right for your community. So I think that's kind of my two takes on it.
Thanks for naming that aspect of like the base and sort of coherence, like base structural funding that's often needed in organizations. And Sonal, I think you alluded to that too. Like, how do we actually keep organizations moving without the constant grant like funding cycle? Aryaana, you had a thought, and then I'm going to loop around to everyone for closing thoughts on the panel. Wow, our time is like flying on this. Thanks.
Yeah, so, you know, I've been doing like grassroots work for like the past 6 years, but this summer I'm actually interning with a philanthropic foundation called Climate Works. And what I've learned is that, you know, when you go from the top to bottom approach, folks often really, really hone in on the numbers and focus on mitigation. And I don't think that's the way. You can't just focus on, you know, like, are we on that 1 degree pathway or 2 degree pathway, like in the hypotheticals, because that like change, you know, in our climate and those temperatures is going to happen from like grassroots actions. So if someone is trying to start a community garden, you know, we should be able to provide funding for that and not just think about the policy level stuff. Or it's super important to get people out to vote, but also like having them understand, what are you voting for? Oh, we're voting for, you know, better recycling in our neighborhood and whatever. So like all of these little things add up, and those things are not getting funded. And the way that like philanthropy and like nonprofit learning just works is, you know, it's a trickle down of money. And if there's one thing we know about trickle down economics, it doesn't work. So the flow of capital ultimately within our system has to change in order for us to have proper climate mitigation.
Thank you. And I'd like to offer a spot now for folks to just have a last thought, a minute or two, sort of on the minute end of last thoughts you might want to share. If you've already sort of shared the thinking that you really think is critical, that's fine too, just let me know. But I would like to just loop around to folks for a last thought. So if I can go to Mill first, and then Daniel will come back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I'll be very brief. I just really want to build off of what Vic and Ariana both just said, which is they're pointing away to just how granular change can be. And Vic, to your point about, you know, people have to be paid to get this stuff done. I've actually had the most success when we really drill into that granular lived reality. And what I'm seeing now is that stakeholders and governments and companies in particular are able to turn on a dime. And when you take, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement platform, and you look at all the entry points for example, companies and governments, there's so much that can be done, and it can be done now. And we don't, and that's the point Ariana was making about, you know, let's not fight over the 1.5 and the 2 and the 3 and the whatever. We have to just get granular. And if to conclude, I would say is that every time I turn around, specifically, I'll pick on trade unions and I'll say, do you have 50% representation? How is your racial makeup? How are the women? Where are the women? And then suddenly it opens up the eyes to what is really missing. So I'm a big fan of granularity, urgency, and really very data-driven, and hold people accountable for equitable representation at every level, every minute of the day.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, well, great panel. I mean, everyone has made such fantastic points, and I think I'll just end by suggesting this. You know, the good news is, the bad news is we've got some really difficult problems to solve. The good news is there's work for everyone to do. I don't care whether you're in retail sales. I don't care whether you're selling life insurance. I don't care whether you're a teacher, a social worker, a construction worker, a carpenter. If we can't, those of us who are committed to education can't make a connection to those activities, any of those activities, and climate change, then we're not doing our job. There's plenty of work for everyone to do, and I'll say that, and also put in a strong vote for letting those large foundations and philanthropists know, make the applications simpler and get people on the ground to work. They have things they can tell you they can do right now and they want to do that affect their families. And that's what we need to be doing. And so my thanks to everyone on this panel. It's been really, really inspiring. So thank you, everyone.
Nick?
Yeah, I think in my closing thoughts, to me, the key word for this panel has sort of been holistic and like considering the full view, and kind of speaking to what Mel just said, but like overall in the entire panel, I feel like I've been thinking sort of how the small view, the little like vignette into someone's day-to-day life and like what matters to them is like incredibly integral to how we build the holistic view. Yeah.
Thank you. Ariana?
Yeah, so as someone who's, pursuing science in college, I would say, listen to the science, obviously, but also, I mean, that's a given. Decolonize your ways of like individual thinking. And what I mean by that is, when we think about climate change, we think about either there's going to be that 2-degree mitigation or not. Either we're going to solve climate change or we're not. And that's very binary level. And it seeps into our, thinking with everything, whether it's our thinking with gender, where it's our thinking with the understanding of race and capital, all of these different things that tie into, who was affected by climate change. Decolonize that, understand your data, but also decolonize your data and just talk to different people. Just talk to different people, who've been doing this work and who also haven't. Just talk to everybody that you can possibly. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sonal, if you can close for us.
Yeah, I'll echo that this has been a great panel and everyone is so smart and has great thoughts and ideas, and I agree with everything everyone said. But in general, education is power and it's so important. And in any type of education that is, whether that is in a traditional classroom or a non-traditional, less considered traditional space, it's incredibly important for us to move forward with our goals for climate change through climate justice. And ultimately that means centering the people most affected, centering Brown, Black, Indigenous, people of color, communities that are dealing with the brunt of this issue, even though they have contributed the least to the problem. And by doing that, we'll improve our world for everyone. So it's, I always think of the statement that the Aboriginal people in Australia said, that our liberation is bound up in our other people's liberation. I know I misquoted that, but the general idea there is really important, because otherwise in this push to address the climate crisis, we will be leaving people behind. And that is the last thing that I think we should be doing. So, let's not lose sight of the fact that a lot of us gathered have the answers. Like, we know and we've done the work, and a lot of people here have done the work for a very long time. We know what we need to do. We know how to center people. We know we know a lot of the solutions already. It's a matter of let's make them happen and let's put our heads together and strategize how to do that.
Thank you all. Thank you all for your time and your gifts of thought in sharing with us today. And we really thank you for your efforts.